My name is Alexis, and I'm the executive director of the Lake Winnipeg Foundation. Unlike Scott, my own science background is not in limnology. For my doctoral research, I studied the population biology and the seed dispersal of genetically modified crops growing outside of agricultural fields in the Canadian prairies. This was an area of study that forced me to realize quite quickly all the other forces that science comes up against when attempting to shape policy. And it was also an area of study where I saw how scientific uncertainty is applied asymmetrically. So new technologies and economic activities are generally assumed to be safe and beneficial from the start, while a huge burden of proof is placed on any potential harms or public concerns. So through that research, I learned that science is not the only force that shapes policy in the world. And that led me into the nonprofit sector and into advocacy work. I wanted to understand those other factors that were also influencing policymaking, and I wanted to make sure that good research and evidence remained central to public decision making. So at LWF, I get to work with an esteemed network of science advisors chaired by Scott, and I also get to work with an incredibly dedicated community of our members, and both of those groups of people are critical ingredients to our advocacy work. So, what are these factors that we have to consider when shaping policy solutions? These are three pretty big ones. Effective policy should be evidence-based. We need good research that tells us what's going to work. We expect policy to be developed to protect and expand the public good. That's a pretty important one. And we also recognize the need to consider cost. Policy solutions must be economically feasible, and we expect them to have a cost that's proportionate to the impact that we see from them. And Scott has shown how these three factors drove effective eutrophication policy around the Great Lakes over 50 years ago. And I think these three factors generally align with a broad public expectation about how policy is made. But they aren't the only influences. Policy making is also heavily influenced by short-term political benefits that it provides to those in power. Compelling policy is as much about good storytelling as anything else, and politicians want to be the heroes. They're looking for a clear story, a cause, and an effect, and they want to see positive results before the next election. So any policy that will take decades to show results is going to be a very hard sell. Scaling up from those political benefits at the individual or the party level, there are also broader economic paradigms that influence policymaking, and this happens regardless of who's in power. An example of this is the post-war economic boom, beginning after World War II and continuing into the 1970s. Governments, regardless of their political affiliation, were generally in agreement on the importance of a strong social safety net. They saw the value of public investment in building stable economies. And they shared the goal of employment for all and reducing income inequality. But now, however, the global political economic paradigm has shifted. Increasing emphasis is placed on growth driven by unrestricted markets. And with increased reliance on market mechanism, public investment and government oversight is reduced. And as a result, industry and business interests play an increasingly influential role. This new economic model is called neoliberalism, and it was first proposed by Austrian economists Hayek and von Mises in interwar Europe. They felt that increased individual economic liberty and decreased state control of the economy was necessary to counteract rising totalitarianism that was being experienced across Europe. Their ideas were further developed in the following decades, with North American business interests funding a broad network of transatlantic think tanks and university departments to refine and popularize the ideas of neoliberalism. The economic model posits that a free and globalized market with limited state intervention will generate the greatest possible prosperity. And even collectivism and social democracy were viewed as potentially dangerous overreaches of state power because they infringed on individual economic liberty. Following the economic crises of the 1970s, neoliberal ideas became mainstream in the 1980s through the policies of Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. And though the word neoliberalism is rarely used by its proponents today, the model continues to have widespread influence on the policies of parties of all political stripes. The premise of unrestricted markets resulting in prosperity for all has caused governments broadly to pull back from regulation. In Manitoba, for example, the branch of government that evaluates the potential environmental impacts of new development projects is called the Environmental Approvals Branch. It's not the Environmental Assessment Branch, not the Environmental Regulation Branch, but Environmental Approvals. And you could argue that that's just a minor semantic detail. But the words that we use in day-to-day governance, or the words that are used on our behalf in governance, shape the policy options that are available to us. So, how do we make good eutrophication policy while contending with all of these influences and competing interests? Let's start with the short-term nature of political decision-making. Unfortunately, it takes longer to upgrade a sewage treatment plant than it does to serve a term of public office. Unlike Lake Erie, Lake Winnipeg has one significant point source of phosphorus. Winnipeg's North End Water Pollution Control Center, we sometimes call it NUPIC, or just the North End Sewage Treatment Plant. The plant was originally built in 1937, and it's badly in need of upgrades. However, contrary to the ELA research that Scott has shared, Manitoba has adopted a dual nutrient policy for eutrophication management, and that requires both nitrogen and phosphorus reduction at the sewage treatment plant. This has increased the cost of the upgrades. High costs then delay construction, and then the costs increase further, and we're in a vicious cycle. So now, as Scott said, treatment plant upgrades are expected to cost over $3 billion, and they won't be complete until sometime in the 1930s or 2030s. That would be amazing. But no, as it is, we are 2 or even 3 generations behind eutrophication management in the Great Lakes. Perhaps unsurprisingly, Manitoba's dual nutrient policy has not succeeded in reducing either nitrogen or phosphorus over the past 20 years. And this is supposed to be the easy part, as Scott has said. Addressing point sources of phosphorus is the low-hanging fruit of eutrophication management. You're supposed to deal with it so you can move on to the more challenging non-point sources. Researchers and advocates have been trying for decades to amend Manitoba's dual nutrient policy, but the province remains steadfast in their approach. And so our first policy challenge was to find a quick fix for Winnipeg sewage treatment that didn't result in resistance from the province. Together with our partners at the International Institute for Sustainable Development, LWF proposed an interim phosphorus reduction solution to be retrofit to the existing treatment plant. Our solution was based on chemical methods of phosphorus reduction, which use ferric chloride to capture the phosphorus before it's released into receiving waters. These are methods that are widely used around the Great Lakes to meet the phosphorus limit of 1 milligram per liter. And ferric chloride was already in use at the North End treatment plant, so we were simply proposing to adjust the dosing location and the dose of the chemical such that it could also function to reduce phosphorus. The retrofit was designed to work on the current plant, and it's also part of the long-term upgrade plan. So there's no wasted investment. We're just building it a little sooner than initially planned. And it helps to immediately offset the ongoing ecological impacts of delays in the full upgrade. So now, with this low-cost, quick fix in place at the largest point source of phosphorus to Lake Winnipeg, we're ready to turn our attention to non-point sources. And as Scott has emphasized, addressing non-point sources is inherently more challenging, and that challenge is particularly pronounced for Lake Winnipeg. Lake Winnipeg's watershed is enormous. It's almost 1 million square kilometers, which is, for context, 13 times larger than Lake Erie's watershed. And Lake Winnipeg's watershed is more sparsely populated, where there are no large urban centers directly on the shore of the lake. This is another big difference from Lake Erie, where 11 million people live in many large cities right around the lake shore. So as a result, non-point sources of phosphorus, with all their inherent complexity, are a much bigger driver of eutrophication for Lake Winnipeg. And unfortunately, the scale and the jurisdictional complexity of this watershed is often presented as a barrier to action. Politicians in Manitoba frequently point to phosphorus contributions coming from other provinces or other jurisdictions as a way to shift responsibility for the problem. Within Manitoba itself, there's limited government water monitoring data available to help us quantify and understand the problem. Generally, the provincial monitoring programs are focused on the larger tributaries to the lake, and sampling activities are limited by the high costs of running a centralized network within a vast watershed. Recently, the provincial government set phosphorus targets for both basins of Lake Winnipeg. This was an effort to provide us with some sort of measuring stick that we could track progress. But problematically, the target for the North Basin is actually higher than current long-term phosphorus levels in the North Basin, and we already see massive algal blooms in the North Basin. So that target doesn't help us at all. And the target for the South Basin calls for a 50% reduction in phosphorus loads, which is great. That's a good, ambitious goal. But there are no additional resources, no new governance mechanisms, no new strategies shared to help us reach that target. And so it's hard to know where to start. There's no clear first step, and there's certainly no single silver bullet that will address non-point sources in the watershed. So at LWF, we set to work once again, this time in partnership with Manitoba's watershed districts, which is a network of on-the-ground water stewardship organizations with deep community connections in Agro-Manitoba. Together, we developed a community-based monitoring program to generate the data needed to start taking action on non-point sources. And it turns out that regular people are very interested in getting involved in Lake Winnipeg solutions. We've had no trouble finding, training, and retaining an amazing network of community volunteers to collect water samples. Our volunteers collect samples close to home so that it's easy for them to get out on the landscape and collect a sample as changes in the flow are observed or following significant weather events. And because of this, community-based monitoring has proven to be an excellent methodology for generating the type of high-resolution phosphorus data that we need to pinpoint phosphorus hotspots in the larger watershed. All of the data that's collected by the network is professionally analyzed by our staff and reviewed by our science advisor. And the data generated is interoperable with the data generated by provincial and federal monitoring programs. Now, these data are used by both government and academics to help target funding, research, and action to phosphorus hotspots, where those investments will have the greatest impact. More broadly, this network is engaging the public directly with Lake Winnipeg challenges and solutions, helping to rebalance the scales of influence when it comes to policy making for water. Which brings me to the third and the most challenging policy influence that we face today regarding Lake Winnipeg's eutrophication. Today's political and economic context is different from that of the 1960s, when ELA research provided scientific certainty about the causes and governments stepped in confidently to regulate the sources of eutrophication. Today, water governance has shifted away from regulation and towards voluntary mechanisms, with much faith placed in that idea that market forces will always tend towards the greater good. The dominant neoliberal paradigm has brought us trickle-down economics, this idea that tax cuts and deregulations and incentives for large corporations will eventually create wealth for us all. We are now faced with trickle-down ecology, the idea that the application of market logics to environmental management will result in clean water and fresh air for us all. And here in Manitoba, we see many examples of these market-based mechanisms of water governance. Almost all of the action undertaken on the landscape is voluntary, with incentive payments used to achieve ecological goods and services. Governments are increasingly interested in managing pollution through water quality trading schemes. Governments are unfortunately divesting from or privatizing water infrastructure and water knowledge production. And there is a marked reluctance to regulate or enforce any of the activities taking place in the watershed, regardless of their downstream impacts. To evaluate the success of this new governance approach, we have largely shifted away from ecological monitoring to counting outputs. So rather than measuring the amount of phosphorus that's sequestered by a particular beneficial management practice, we're now counting how many acres are under that beneficial management practice. And that doesn't give us much ecological data to go on. So the shift away from regulatory methods of governance and towards voluntary incentive-based methods has also been accompanied by that strange asymmetry that I mentioned at the beginning, where scientific uncertainty is presented as a barrier to strengthening regulatory approaches to governance, but not to adopting market-based approaches. But based on what we already know, there are opportunities to strengthen water protection policy in Manitoba. And I want to consider some examples from Manitoba's manure management regulation. In Manitoba, a soil test phosphorus level of 20 parts per million is considered very high, according to our soil fertility guidelines. Manitoba's Clean Environment Commission has noted that for many crops, there is no agronomic benefit from the application of phosphorus when the soil test phosphorus levels are above 20 parts per million. But notably, manure application is allowed at much higher soil test phosphorus levels, where we would expect no additional agronomic benefits to the crops. So at soil test phosphorus levels of up to 180 parts per million, which is 9 times higher than the soil fertility guideline, manure phosphorus can be applied at up to 5 times the annual crop removal rate. The assumption here is that that manure phosphorus is going to stay put. It'll sit in the field, patiently waiting to fertilize 5 consecutive annual crops. Similarly, manure can be applied to agricultural fields in Manitoba throughout October and November. This is long after the growing season has ended and well before the next crop will be planted. The assumption is again that that phosphorus will remain in place throughout Manitoba's significant spring melt, the season when we see the largest flush of water and phosphorus off the land and into our local waterways. We don't need more scientific research to identify some significant concerns with the assumptions underlying this regulation. We don't need more scientific research to see 1 or 2 clear opportunities to strengthen these regulations to reduce phosphorus runoff from manure spread fields. Scientific uncertainty is not the barrier here. It's not what's preventing a more effective regulatory approach. Rather, the barrier is that imbalance in the underlying influences that shape this policy. Because this regulation reads less as a tool to effectively fertilize Manitoba's crops or to protect downstream water quality, and it reads more like a waste disposal opportunity for industry. So what's the solution here? It's to reset that balance, to increase the influence that the public has in policymaking. And in fact, this is a critical ingredient to all of the policy successes I've talked about today. It underlies everything that LWF does through our advocacy, public engagement. And of course, good policy can't be shaped without good scientific advice. That's what brought me to advocacy work in the first place. LWF science advisors ensure that our priorities and our programs are evidence-based. Our staff team then translates that evidence into accessible policy solutions that are well suited to the current political and economic context. And finally, it is our members that amplify that message, that carry it across the finish line, making sure that it reaches the politicians' ears. When our members speak up, They demonstrate broad and sustained public support for tangible government action to protect water. With this recipe for evidence-based advocacy, we aim to counteract the increasingly dominant role of short-term political benefits and industry interests in guiding water policy. We aim to restore a balance so that research and public interest are again central to how we make decisions about our water, as they were when we were tackling phosphorus loading to the Great Lakes 50 years ago. In the intervening 50 years, as Scott has shown us, the science has not stopped. The experiments have adapted and evolved. They've answered new questions. In the intervening 50 years, public concern for our lakes and rivers has not dwindled. If anything, it has increased. Eutrophication remains a widespread concern, complicated by a changing climate. The weight of these policy influences is sufficient to prompt action. We know enough and we care enough to do much more than what is currently being done on the governance side of things. And so now it's up to us to change that. The good news is we've had success in the past, many successes over the past 50 years. Science, policy, and the public have worked together to effectively address phosphorus loading from point sources. Our success in point source phosphorus reduction around the Great Lakes has shown us clearly that eutrophication can be reversed. And collaborative initiatives like community-based monitoring demonstrate widespread public interest in contributing to tangible solutions that make a measurable difference. And so our responsibility now, all of us in this room together, is to balance and integrate all of these influences, to work together as researchers, as policymakers, as advocates, and members of the concerned public, so that we can act with the speed, the scale, and the fairness that the challenge of eutrophication demands of us. Thank you. Sure.
That was incredible. That was really, really good. Thank you so much, both of you. We have a few minutes for questions. There's some microphones circulating in the room, I think. It's really hard to see up here. So like, oh, there's one back.
Yep.
My granny, it looks like.
Mike, no, it's B.
Oh, there you go. It's B. Sorry, B. I really can't see
goodbye.
anything.
Yeah, he's just. So my question, based on what I've seen in Quebec, working with lake associations and their issues around eutrophication, is the question of legacy nutrients and how do you get that across to the public that it may take 10, 20 years longer than they expect. And I'm always feeling that that issue needs to be also presented up front to avoid disappointment.
Yeah, that's a tough one. It's, you can't shoot yourself in the foot before you've even started, right? So we do need to balance the successes with the challenges. And we work to find smaller scale metrics than, say, the concentration in the lake and all of the factors influencing it, which is why I show things like the phosphorus the concentration coming out of the effluent of the North End treatment plant. We sort of need to chunk this problem into smaller pieces and make sure that we have to be honest, but we can't discourage action.
Thanks.
Thank you both for a great talk. I really enjoyed it. I just recently moved to the Steinbach area, and I was horrified to see we are in the epicenter of phosphorus contributions. But I guess it doesn't surprise me too much. It's an area of intense hog farming as well as agriculture. And you pointed out some of the statistics in terms of soil quality or soil guidelines for phosphorus and then manure spreading. And I wonder, like, how much of that is just it's here, where do we put it kind of thing for the hog waste? And what can be done about that kind of like really close linkage?
Yeah, there's definitely a concentration problem with those sort of intense livestock operations. So when they're all located in a very localized area, the cost of transporting the manure farther afield to be able to spread it in a more effective agronomic way is cost prohibitive. So what we really need to do is look at allocating the livestock according to the land base. So we need to understand how much manure phosphorus is going to be produced by how many animals, and then how can we sustainably ensure that that doesn't create an imbalance in the phosphorus cycle in a particularly concentrated area of the province.